It was a seemingly perfect family. They lived in a small, quiet community, in a modest but well-kept house. The family consisted of 3 members: David, a hard-working and dedicated man, his wife Elena, a loving and home-loving woman, and their only daughter, Sophia, a young woman with a cheerful spirit and big dreams. From the outside, any neighbor would say that they were the picture of family harmony, of those families that seemed destined to live in peace. Elena, the mother, had left her job at a local grocery store so she could take care of Sophia when she was a child, while David worked at a construction company in the city. He was a tall man, with a strong build and serene gaze. He had a calm character that rarely changed. Although his job required long hours, he always made sure to return home to share dinner with his wife and daughter. Sophia was his pride and joy, a sweet and responsible daughter who loved spending time with her parents. During her childhood, Sophia enjoyed a healthy relationship with her father. David always showed himself to be a protective father, helping her with her studies, taking her to her sports practices, and devoting much of his free time to her. It was evident that Sophia adored her father and that the two shared a special bond. Over time, the relationship between father and daughter grew stronger, and the family seemed increasingly united. However, as Sophia grew up, the atmosphere at home began to change in ways that were imperceptible to everyone. The innocent girl left her childish games behind and began to transform into a young and attractive woman. Her interests expanded and, when she turned 19, Sophia began to experience the first glimpses of independence. She wanted to know the world beyond the limits of her small town. She longed for new experiences and, of course, she began to have the typical desires of any person her age: friends, studies, and, perhaps, a romance. But these changes did not go unnoticed by David, her father. Although he had always been protective, something in his attitude intensified. She began to observe Sophia in a different way, with an interest that was beginning to become disconcerting. At first, she tried to hide it, fighting the discomfort of those dark thoughts that were beginning to emerge in her mind. She still wanted to be the loving and exemplary father, but her perception of Sophia was changing in a disturbing way and, little by little, she was beginning to cross a dangerous line in her mind. Elena noticed certain changes in David, but she attributed them to the tension at work and the emotional wear and tear that comes with being the sole provider of the home. In addition, Sophia also seemed somewhat distant lately, which Elena considered normal for a young woman of her age. She believed that everything was a phase, a stage in which Sophia needed some space, so she decided not to intervene, thinking that any kind of confrontation might be unnecessary. But she did not know that, in reality, that apparent distance hid the beginning of something much darker, something that would transform the family dynamic forever. David found himself trapped in a devastating moral dilemma. She knew that her feelings were not normal and that, as a father, he had a responsibility to care for and protect his daughter. However, her mind seemed to be losing control. Her obsession grew daily, and although she tried hard to avoid it, images of Sophia kept flooding her thoughts. She tried to occupy her mind with work, with household chores, and tried to interact with Sophia as she did before, but it was increasingly difficult to keep up appearances. For Sophia, her relationship with her father was also starting to become uncomfortable. Although she still couldn't identify the exact reason, she felt that the way David looked at her had changed. His comments, his gestures, and even his tone of voice seemed different. Instead of the closeness of before, she now felt that her father's presence disturbed her. That feeling of discomfort intensified in the moments when David tried to spend time with her alone, looking for excuses to keep her close. Sophia began to avoid him as much as she could without arousing suspicion in her mother, who remained oblivious to the real tension that was beginning to build in her home. For his part, David was increasingly trapped in the abyss of his own emotions. His mind was clouded by fantasies he could not control, forbidden images that tormented him even in his dreams. Every day, the internal struggle became more unbearable, and the feeling of guilt consumed him. He began to drink in secret, trying to drown those impulses with alcohol. But far from calming his obsession, the effect was quite the opposite. His attraction to Sophia became more and more intense, more difficult to conceal. Elena began to notice the change in David. His absences from home became longer and, when he was present, he seemed distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else. However, she tried to justify his behavior, telling herself that he was dealing with work stress. After all, David had always been an exemplary husband and father. She could not imagine that the man with whom she had shared years of her life could harbor such dark thoughts. As the months went by, David began to look for more opportunities to be alone with Sophia. taking advantage of any moment when Elena was busy or out of the house. The tension between them became increasingly evident, although neither of them mentioned anything about it. Sophia tried not to be alone with her father, but David seemed increasingly determined to cross that invisible barrier. The situation at home was becoming unsustainable, and the family dynamic, once happy and serene, was now plagued by awkward silences and furtive glances. That obsession that David harbored in secret was not only destroying his relationship with Sophia, but it was undermining the emotional stability of both. The pressure was growing, and David began to feel that he was on the verge of losing control. He was no longer able to withstand the limits that he had imposed on himself, and in the end, those repressed feelings would end up pushing him to commit acts that he would never have imagined. The shadows in his mind grew thicker, and darkness took hold, setting the stage for the tragedy to come. The atmosphere in the house, previously so cozy and warm, began to take on a dark and gloomy tone. Sophia felt that something sinister was brewing, but she didn't know how to react or who to talk to about it. Her mother continued to ignore what was happening between them, while David became more and more insistent. Finally, the first step towards tragedy was about to occur. David, unable to contain his obsession, was ready to cross a line that he could never undo. As time went by, David's boundaries between paternal love and a disturbing attraction to his daughter Sophia became increasingly blurred. The internal struggle he had felt at first weakened before the strength of his desires, which he could no longer control. His obsession grew in the darkness, fueled by thoughts that he could not eradicate from his mind. With each passing day, his behavior became more unusual and difficult to hide, and despite the guilt that tormented him, he was no longer able to resist. David began to find ways to be alone with Sophia. He looked for excuses to get closer, small moments in which they could talk without Elena being present. He concealed his true intentions with kindness and tenderness, making Sophia believe that he was simply a concerned and protective father. However, David's gestures and looks began to cross a line that Sophia perceived even if she could not fully understand. At first, Sophia thought her father's behavior was due to an excessive interest in her life. She attributed it to an overprotection typical of any father. But soon she began to notice that his gazes lasted longer than normal and that physical contact became more and more invasive. She tried to hide her discomfort, but the tension between them grew clearly, and the discomfort she felt every time they were alone became unbearable. David, on the other hand, was completely losing control. That obsession that he had tried to repress had become an insatiable need, an addiction that dominated every aspect of his life. As the days passed, the need to act on those impulses became impossible to ignore. He began to justify his thoughts and desires, convincing himself that what he felt was something unique, something that no one else could understand. This distortion of reality fueled his obsession, and in the end, in a moment of weakness, he decided that he could no longer continue to repress those desires. It was one afternoon, when Elena had gone out to do some shopping at the market, when David found the opportunity he had been waiting for so long. Sophia was in her room, distracted and oblivious to her father's intentions. David approached with a trivial excuse, starting a seemingly innocent conversation. Sophia, although somewhat uncomfortable, received him without suspecting her father's true intentions. But, as the minutes passed, David subtly crossed boundaries, getting closer and closer to her and trying to break any barrier of resistance she might have. David's words at first were kind, but they began to take on a more intimate tone, until his insinuations became clear. Sophia was paralyzed. She could not understand what was happening, and a feeling of disgust and confusion invaded her. She tried to stop her father, trying to escape the situation, but David convinced her that everything was fine, that it was a secret between the two of them and that no one else should know about it. The manipulation and emotional control he exerted over her left her defenseless. And, not knowing how to react, Sophia ended up succumbing to that psychological pressure. That first meeting marked a point of no return in the relationship between father and daughter. David, now sure that he could achieve what he wanted, began to look more frequently for opportunities to be alone with Sophia, emotionally manipulating her and forcing her to keep that destructive relationship a secret. Sophia, caught in a whirlwind of emotions, did not know how to get out of that situation. She felt that her life had become a nightmare, a trap from which she could not escape. She was paralyzed by fear, pain, and shame, unable to ask for help or face the truth. Each meeting they had increased Sophia's feeling of guilt and despair. She felt that she was betraying her mother, herself, and that she was completely losing control of her life. She tried to distance herself from her father on several occasions, but David always found a way to convince her that she should remain silent, that what was happening between them was something that no one else would understand. The emotional manipulation was so intense that Sophia eventually gave in, resigned to living in a world where abuse and guilt were her daily reality. Meanwhile, Elena, though oblivious to the details, began to notice certain changes in the behavior of her husband and daughter. David was becoming more distant and reserved, and Sophia seemed to be more withdrawn and sad than usual. Elena, worried about her daughter's well-being, tried to approach her and talk to her, but Sophia avoided any deep conversation, fearing that her mother would discover the truth. The tension in the home was palpable, and although Elena tried to ignore it, her instinct told her that something was not right. The atmosphere in the house, which was once a refuge of peace and tranquility, had transformed into a dark and oppressive space. David and Sophia avoided Elena as much as they could, aware that any carelessness could reveal the secret they were hiding. Guilt and fear consumed Sophia, while David, blinded by his obsession, seemed not to see the damage he was causing to his own daughter and his family. Every encounter they shared was a reminder of the tragedy to come, of the inevitable destruction they were wreaking on their home. Eventually, David's hold on Sophia began to weaken. Sophia, tired of living in such a distressing situation, began to question whether she should break the silence and tell someone the truth. She could no longer bear the pressure of living with such a dark secret, and every day she felt the desperation consume her a little more. However, the fear of the consequences and her mother's reaction kept her trapped in an emotional dilemma that seemed to have no way out. Despite her efforts to appear normal, Elena began to suspect that the relationship between David and Sophia was not as innocent as it seemed. She began to observe more closely each interaction between them, noticing the tension in their gestures and the discomfort in her daughter's gaze. Every time David and Sophia spent time together, Elena's intuition told her that something was going on behind her back, something that went far beyond what she could imagine. The tension in the home reached a critical point one afternoon, when Elena decided to return home earlier than expected. Upon entering the house, she heard voices coming from her daughter's room and, following her instinct, she approached quietly. What she witnessed at that moment confirmed her worst suspicions. The scene she saw was so shocking that she could hardly believe what her eyes were showing her. Her husband and daughter were together in a situation that left no room for doubt about what was happening between them. The shock of that revelation left Elena speechless. Her world fell apart in an instant, and the rage and disgust she felt towards her husband were stronger than any other emotion she had ever experienced. David's betrayal was too much for her, and the pain of seeing her daughter in that situation filled her with a rage that she could not control. In his mind, there was no longer room for forgiveness or understanding. The only response he could conceive was revenge. Elena decided at that moment that her husband could not go on living after what he had done. The idea of a plan to end his life began to take shape in her mind, and the anger she felt towards him turned into a ruthless determination. She knew she had to be careful, that she could not allow David to suspect her intentions, but in her heart she was determined to end this tragedy in the only way she could conceive. Meanwhile, Sophia, caught in a whirlwind of emotions, did not know that her mother had discovered the truth and had begun to hatch a plan to get rid of her father. Elena, caught in a whirlwind of anger and pain after discovering the dark secret between her husband and her daughter, could not bear the betrayal that had shattered her family life. What she had seen had not only destroyed her trust in David, but had also broken everything she valued in her life. The idea of a direct confrontation was not enough for her. For her, David had crossed an unforgivable line, and there was no other option than to end his life. The seed of revenge quickly grew in her mind, until it became a ruthless decision. Elena began to observe David with a new perspective, analyzing each of his movements, waiting for the perfect moment to execute her plan. Coexistence in the house became more tense than it already was. David, although he tried to act normally, was aware that something had changed in Elena. The coldness in her gaze and her deathly silence made him suspect that she might have discovered the truth, but he did not dare to inquire, fearing the answer. Meanwhile, Sophia noticed her mother's strange behavior and began to worry that something terrible was about to happen. The weight of guilt tormented her, and although she did not know how to approach the subject with her mother, she suspected that the tension in the home was reaching a point of no return. Sophia felt trapped between fear of her father and her mother's enigmatic silence, and the anguish of not knowing what would happen consumed her day by day. One night, Elena decided that the time had come to act. She knew that David could not continue to harm her daughter and that the only way to protect her was to get rid of him once and for all. She had been planning silently for weeks, taking care of every detail to ensure that no one would suspect her. She had carefully prepared a dinner, in which she placed a lethal dose of poison in David's food, making sure that Sophia would not realize her intentions. Elena's plan was simple and direct: eliminate David without raising suspicions, letting the poison take effect while he was off guard. David, oblivious to his wife's intentions, sat at the table with a calm attitude, trying to hide any concern. Elena stared at him, containing the fury that still burned within her, and when the time came, she served him dinner with a terrifying calm. Sophia was also at the table, trying to act as if everything was normal, although she felt that something dark and dangerous was happening. The poison began to take effect quickly. David, noticing a strange sensation in his body, tried to hide his discomfort, but the pain he soon felt was unbearable. Within minutes, his face contorted into an expression of agony, and in a last attempt to seek help, he looked at Elena, who watched him with a cold and imperturbable expression. For her, that moment was the justice she had longed for, and she did not show even a shred of compassion as her husband succumbed to the poison. A horrified Sophia witnessed her father's death without fully understanding what was happening. Panic gripped her, and upon seeing David's condition, she began to scream, demanding an explanation. It was then that Elena, with disturbing calm, confessed to Sophia what she had done and the reason behind her act. She explained that she had discovered the relationship between her and her father, and that she could not allow that man to continue destroying their lives. Sophia was in a state of shock. Although deep inside she felt relief at knowing that David could no longer hurt her, the brutality of her mother's revenge left her paralyzed. Elena was arrested shortly after. The authorities, after investigating David's death, discovered enough evidence to charge her with murder. During the trial, disturbing details about the secret relationship that had existed between David and Sophia were revealed, and the story attracted the attention of the media and the local community, who were shocked to learn the details of that family tragedy. Sophia, devastated by the loss of both parents, was forced to face the consequences of that dark chapter in her life alone. Her family's story became a case study in the news and was the subject of intense debate. Although she was not charged with any crime, the stigma and emotional weight of her experience led her to a situation of isolation, unable to trust people again or reintegrate into a normal life. Elena, in her final statement, admitted that she had acted out of rage and desperation. She expressed that her intention was never to hurt Sophia, but to free her from her father's influence, and although her act had been ruthless, she considered it a final act of love to protect her daughter. Elena's statement divided public opinion. Some saw her as a vengeful and out-of-control mother, while others felt compassion for her situation, understanding that she had been pushed to an extreme that few could bear. The trial ended with a prison sentence for Elena, who was convicted of first-degree murder. The image of that happy, united family faded completely, and the memory of what they once were was buried under the weight of the tragic events that had changed their lives forever. Sophia was left an orphan, forever marked by an experience that no one could fully understand. The toxic and destructive relationship she had lived with her father, coupled with her mother's brutal revenge, left her emotionally shattered. She tried to start over in different places, looking for a refuge where she could escape her past, but the memory of her family always haunted her, reminding her of the tragedy that had shattered her life.